Good morning and welcome to another edition of the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known on this Tuesday, January 25th, 2022. Mental health, the stigma of mental illness in Black America. Is it real? On the heels of the tragic suicide of Ian Alexander Jr., the son of superstar actress and director Regina King, we take a deep dive into the stresses, the triggers in the Black community where trauma, unmatched adversity, and racism and discrimination has reported 1 in 4 affected by mental illness in the Black community, and with 20% of Black adults more likely to experience mental health issues than the rest of the population. Joining us this morning are Dr. Jeff Menzies, a clinical psychologist and professor at Morgan State University, Faye McCray, editor-in-chief of Psych Central for Healthline Media, psychotherapist Sonny Etienne, and journalist Katrina Hamilton and Sam Collins. And we hope you, the audience, will join us with your questions and comments and share this important broadcast on your platforms and that of your friends and loved ones. But first, we're going to dive into the headlines of the morning with Sam Collins of the Washington Informer and Katrina Hamilton of the Muslim Journal. Good morning, Sam and Katrina.
Good morning, Stacey.
So the first topic this morning, J. Alexander Kung, Thomas Lane, and Tao Thao are charged with deprivation of rights under color of law for allegedly failing to give George Floyd medical aid on May 25th, 2020. The indictment states that the 3 men aided Derek Chauvin, the convicted officer, in the killing of George Floyd. Their federal trial began on Monday with the completion of jury selection and opening statements. We're going to see what happens here. They are immediately they're distancing themselves, as you would expect, Sam and Katrina, from Derek Chauvin, saying that, hey, it was him, not us.
Yes, it's interesting because once again, when we're talking about dehumanization of African American people and really not, you know, looking at us as if we exist or if we matter, right? And the first thing they're going to say is, Officer Thao was, Asian, Vietnamese, and the other officer was biracial of African. He was African American and white. But the reality is, and I talk about this with, the racial trauma, but these one of the officers, he had his his knee on his back, on George Floyd's back, and the Asian officer, Thao, he looked on, he looked away, as if it's like you know this didn't matter. No one intervened, and it's traumatizing, especially when we're talking about that COVID. On top of that, claimed 375,000 American deaths and disproportionately impacted Black Americans, leaving a lot of our children parentless. But then we're looking at this death. They can't get away with this.
Well, the federal charges, the federal trial has kicked off. So we're going to see, Sam, exactly what comes of this. Sam, one quick question on that. Are we really paying attention, Black America, America as a whole, paying attention to this federal trial? Or are we just satisfied with the conviction of Derek Chauvin?
I think Black America is paying attention, just given the fact that Black Americans often experience when getting pulled over by the police, by virtue of actually getting ambushed. Speaking for myself and relying on the experience of others who I interview, police officers often ambush Black people during stops. They stop them 4, 5, 6 at a time, and officers often follow the lead of their colleagues in anything that they do. There's a blue wall of silence, and this trial is a test case in knocking down that wall. So I think that Black people in America are paying attention. The degree to which they are paying attention is questionable, but I don't think that we'll ever be satisfied with anything that happens within the walls of justice, so-called.
Yeah. Also in the news this morning, the Supreme Court agreed yesterday to hear challenges to the admissions process at Harvard and the University of North Carolina, presenting the most serious threat in decades to the use of affirmative action by the nation's public and private colleges and universities. Despite similar challenges, the court has repeatedly upheld affirmative action in the past. but two liberal justices who were key to those decisions are gone, Anthony Kennedy and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Their replacements, Trump appointees Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, are conservative and considered less likely to find the practice constitutional. In the latest case, groups backed by a longtime opponent of affirmative action, Edward Blum of Maine, sued Harvard and UNC in federal court, claiming its undergraduate admission system discriminated against Asian American students in the Harvard case, and both Asian American and white students in the North Carolina case. Lower courts ruled that the school's limited consideration of race was a legitimate effort to achieve a more diverse student body. So here we are, affirmative action now under serious threat by the Supreme Court. And so, Sam, Katrina, it's something else to be, to watch.
It's an example of fear of a black planet, and you see oftentimes in policy there's a tug and a tug of war, so to speak. Whenever we address inequities within the system by creating pathways for black people and people of other nationalities and ethnicities to get into universities, then you have the white establishment. They're pushing back as well, because in a sense, and let's be honest, they see their way of life, they see things that they've put up being threatened. And if we can be even more honest, white people have had affirmative action for as long as this country has been in existence. They just don't call it affirmative action. They call it legacy admission. They call it word of mouth. They call it whatever the case is, and just making sure that they're upholding whatever pathway they have to make sure that their children and their associates have as much power as possible. So we're looking at a power play, and we're looking at a group and institutions who are threatened by what they consider the end to their legitimacy.
And I also want to add to that. I was reflecting on this yesterday. What we're also seeing is a co-opting of yet another Black movement. This happened in the 60s and 70s when we had the civil rights movement. And then I know a lot of sisters may be upset at me, but then we came up with the feminist movement. And the women who benefit from affirmative action, it's statistically proven, are white women. And so now we have this new movement that happened in 2020. And as we're moving towards addressing anti-Black racism, I know a lot of BIPOC folks are going to be mad at me now, but the Asians, Americans, have co-opted yet another Black movement, and we have to start addressing this. I think we keep this as a black white binary, but anti-Black racism happens all over the world. It happens in Asia, it happens in Europe. It's all over, and we have to just call a spade and stop playing.
Stop playing. Also in the news this morning, Senator Bernie Sanders on Sunday said Senate Republicans are, quote unquote, laughing all the way to Election Day, since Democrats have yet to schedule a vote on the party's signature social spending bill, which has languished in the upper chamber due to intra-party divisions. During an interview yesterday, the Vermont Independent and chairman of the Senate Budget Committee said Senate Republicans have essentially been left off the hook in casting votes for consequential pieces of legislation as lawmakers look toward the November midterm elections. Bernie Sanders says, what has bothered me very much is the Republicans are laughing all the way to Election Day. They have not had to cast one bloody vote, which shows us where they're at. And we have got to change that. So while the Senate easily passed the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill championed by President Joe Biden last year, the larger social spending bill, which was originally pegged at $3.5 trillion before it was whittled down to roughly half of that, fell victim to opposition by Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Kirsten Sinema of Arizona, and a lengthy back and forth with the president led nowhere. So Senator Sanders is just speaking out loud what many of the constituents are saying, isn't he?
I mean, he is, right? And I just want somebody to explain to me I don't want to say the purpose of Senator Tim Scott, but like what's going on with that brother's conscience, right? But I mean, the reality is we're always talking about balancing out Republicans and Democrats. Why is it that most African Americans are Democrats? But this is clearly an example as to why we can't put our faith in the Republican Party. And I will say that I was a registered Republican for many years just to try to balance it out. And I realized that this is not working, you know.
Mhm.
And so I think that more of us need to become more independent, and we need to stop, just again giving our pledging our allegiance to one party so that we can have more say in what's going on, because obviously it's, I don't want to say it's not working for us, but we're still talking about voting rights in 2022.
Yeah, how about that? Well, the stigma of mental illness in the Black community, is it real? Well, let's discuss. Dr. Jeff Menzies, a clinical psychologist and professor at Morgan State University, joins us, as well as Faye McCray, editor-in-chief of Psych Central for Healthline Media, and psychotherapist Sonny Etienne. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you, sir.
Well, we are so glad to have you. Let's start off. Dr. Menzies, I'm going to go right to you. How real is the stigma of mental illness in the Black community?
The stigma, of course, is very real. And I think that people, when we hear, because right now, stigma, mental health, the stigma around mental illness is kind of like a buzzword now, a catchphrase. And I don't know if people really understand what it means. Stigma means, it's something to be avoided. It's something that you don't want to engage. And that engagement can be avoided on many levels. One, the conversation level. People don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about mental illness, mental health status. People don't feel comfortable, and of course, I'm generally speaking, don't feel comfortable seeking mental health services. And that happens for a variety of reasons, whether it's they can't find a provider that they like, or a provider that matches their criteria, whether it's a distrust, a mistrust for the system overall. People could avoid it because they lack resources. There are many reasons why people will avoid it. But then there's also the stigma of self-care. A lot of times we have this attitude or ideology that we have to be the strongest that we can be. We have to keep pushing through no matter what. In other words, we don't ever want to appear weak or vulnerable, or as if we need any type of assistance or help. And again, that there is appropriate for certain contexts and certain environments, because if you're living in a world where vulnerability or weakness gets you taken out, you definitely don't show it. Gets you taken advantage of, then you definitely don't show it. You have to be as tough as possible. So all of those things kind of culminate in this general and broad term of what we call stigma, which is basic avoidance of, the conversation, the pursuit of services, or even the self-care that could actually prevent it.
Yeah, and Faye, you've looked into this issue a lot from all standpoints, and we're seeing 20% of Black adults, for instance, are more likely to have mental health issues. Young kids are committing suicide. We saw the unfortunate situation over the weekend. Regina King's son, Ian Alexander Jr., committed suicide, 26 years old. What are you finding in the Black community specifically when it comes to suicide and mental health issues?
Yeah, I mean, the rates are staggering. They intensify with children, they intensify with teenagers. And, it goes beyond stigma. I mean, there are real inequities in access to care. 84% of psychologists are white. And yet by 2030, we're supposed to grow by 24% in populations of color. So just let that sink in, those disparities. The mental health profession continues to be really ill-equipped to meet the needs of communities of color. And that is so important for getting on the front lines of these rates, because they're rising in our communities, and we need to address it.
And Dr. Sonny, I want to go to you, because we know that our youth are really struggling as well. Suicides, mental health issues. What's going on with Black youth? Why is it such a strain on Black youth today?
It's not one singular reason why. I think it's everything dating back to, of course, the legacy and history of persons of color in this country. But then also there's what youth face today. As a psychotherapist in clinical practice, of course, I get a chance to meet with youth on a very individual level. I think it all starts with how they see themselves. So there's self-perception, which then leads to some of the destructive behaviors, if not some of the internalization that I see often with young people. Also a lack of support, but also it's what goes on with the youth in their various schools, in their communities. And so often you'll find children who struggle to find a sense of selfhood, and they turn to what I think now is becoming a growing problem, methods of coping that in the past were not necessarily as prominent within Black, the Black community.
Yeah. And we talk about the stigma. We talk, and you guys mentioned it, but the stigma here. So with more awareness, right? Doesn't that stigma kind of goes away a little bit? Dr. Menzies, we've seen high-profile athletes like Simone Biles and Serena Williams and Naomi Osaka talk about taking mental health breaks. So yes, the conversation is happening, right?
Yeah, there's plenty of conversation taking place. I work with Taraji P. Henson and the Boris Lawrence Henson Foundation on their clinical advisory council. And, so we're talking about erasing stigma. We're providing, free services to people regularly. And so the conversation and the awareness does take place, but the awareness doesn't necessarily erase the stigma. And it's a really interesting balance here when we're talking about increasing awareness around the need for mental health services. And when you look at, so you get to a certain point of awareness, and it might make you more hesitant when you become aware of certain things. And so it's almost like you got to push past, like you got to know enough to know you need to know more. And then once you know enough, you have to push past that point. So for example, as a good brother was just speaking about, we've got this legacy of oppression and being enslaved and, all these different things that have happened under the auspices of mental health services. In fact, the APA recently issued an apology, for their participation in upholding racist practices, racist and white supremacist practices within the realm of mental health. And so when you start learning these things, and if you look at that historical timeline that they list in their apology, you're like, wow, these are all of the things that happened. I knew I wasn't crazy for not wanting to go talk to a quote unquote shrink. One other thing, though, I wanted to point out really quickly is that it's not necessarily only about increasing the number of Black practitioners or people of color that are practitioners of mental health or mental health providers. It's also about increasing competency, because we can have all the Black folks. I mean, we can have 100% Black mental health service providers, and if they're culturally incompetent, or if they're constantly just pushing the Western way and only adhering to Western definitions of what mental health is, mental illness, we're only looking at the characteristics that are listed according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, which is quote unquote the Bible, for providing mental health services, definitely for billing. Then we're still going to be doing a disservice to our people. I used to do cultural competency training for mental health social service agencies, as well practiced and did all my training with an African-centered organization, where we began to understand and expand our worldview about what it is to actually be human, because not even everybody has that same definition. And just real quick, we know Big Mama have a dream about fish, and she'll wake up and what does that mean, y'all? What does it mean?
Somebody's baby, right?
Somebody's pregnant. You see, I can say that in another context. People, I don't understand it. And she would be correct. She would know exactly where to call, and somebody will be with child. And so we have these other ways of understanding life and reality that if we don't incorporate that into our services to help people to gain access and get a firmer grip on reality, then we're selling them short from the jump.
Yeah, well, hey, Dr. Menzies, my grandmother used to say her hand was itching. That means she was getting money. So, Faye, I want to throw this question to you, Faye, because one of our viewers, Daniela Pierre, says that the conversation is happening. However, it seems that those who are impacted are the ones who speak up. We appreciate those who do speak up. It takes the collective whole to effectuate change. Your response to that?
I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, obviously, as we talked about, the more people that are in highly visible positions speak about these issues, the more transparency we have and the more people feel comfortable to speak about them, but I just want to piggyback on what Dr. Menzies was saying about those non-traditional forms of care. We have to validate that. We have to validate that you can talk to your beauty, shop owner about things that you're going through. And that is a form of community care. That is a form of self-care. So validating those methods, just speaking out, speaking about your pain, asking for help. So often, particularly as a Black woman, you give into that strong Black woman trope because we're magic, right? And, we're extraordinary and we're capable of so many things. But what we lack often is asking for help and admitting to that vulnerability and making the space for ourselves to do that. So I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, that's a great comment.
Yeah, and so before we bring our esteemed journalists back I'm sure they have a million questions for you guys. Let me ask you this, and I'll start with Dr. Sonny, and then we can, Dr. Menzies, you can certainly chime in, and certainly Faye, you can as well. How do you identify the signs of, say, depression or other mental illness?
Well, with depression, typically you want to look for whether or not there's been a decrease in sleep, there's been an increase in or decrease with concentration levels, eating habits will change. But also you'll see a person start to withdraw themselves, socially from family, friends, and so forth. With anxiety, typically it's evident by racing thoughts. Sometimes I think persons don't have the vernacular to always articulate what they're going through. So sometimes they'll throw up their hands and just say that I'm just going through stuff. I think, and that's part of the stigmatization. It's not always welcoming or just how they'll be perceived. And so a person will tend to just kind of shy away from opening up. And those are usually the telltale signs that there's something probably off with the person mentally, if not emotionally.
Yeah, Dr. Menzies?
Yeah, it's very important that we also understand how technology is shifting the playing field right now. It's very difficult now to identify when a child is being withdrawn because they're constantly withdrawn now, and it's almost like a new norm. And so you have to tap in different ways. It's like and I know see somebody's asking about children in school. I've worked as a school psychologist in DC public schools for years, and the whole landscape of the school system where there's bullying, there may be insufficient monitoring and supervision, but children sometimes receive all kind of pressure from their peer group. And then again, with the advent of social media and this technology, this becomes their world. Their world becomes what's on that flat screen right there. Not entire, but a lot of their identity and their identity, a sense of self, things that were spoken about earlier, revolve around how they engage in these virtual worlds. And so, you get bullying, you get labeled. Somebody might take an embarrassing picture or video of you, and they launch that out to millions and millions of people. People hiding behind screen names, giving you heartless comments and judgments. All of that begins to impact a person's sense of value in the world. And when a person's sense of value in the world diminishes beyond a certain threshold, then they start wondering, should I even continue to be in this world? Would it be more of a relief to leave this world than to remain in this world? And that's beyond the typical depression leading up to it, leading to suicidal ideation, and it goes beyond that now. And I think that we maintain that traditional perspective of what does suicide look like when it goes from ideation to attempt to success. We have to start understanding that sometimes children see that other people who may have committed suicide get a lot of attention on social media after they do it. They say, hey, I've never felt that value before, let me do this, not thinking, or maybe thinking I won't be able to even enjoy it because I'll be gone, but they'll do it in hopes of getting this large fanfare of people pouring into their page. There's so many different levels that we have to begin to address, as we continue to move into this technological age.
Yeah. So, Faye, it's not a sign of weakness, right? Having a thoughts of suicide, thoughts of the fact that you have depression or anxiety or some sort of mental illness. One of the part of that stigma has always been, oh, you must be weak, but that's not it, right?
No, absolutely not. I mean, we can't devalue the times that we're living in. We're still in the midst of a global pandemic, right? And when you think about just what we just experienced too with witnessing George Floyd, be murdered 2 years ago, that video was filmed by a teenage girl, and we can't underestimate the impact of racial trauma in these times that we're living in on our community. So we need to acknowledge that it is okay, to be feeling the things that we're feeling. It's okay to need to close TikTok or Instagram just because it is overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's bring back our esteemed journalists. I know they're teeming with questions. Sam Collins and Katrina Hamilton. We'll start with you, Katrina. I know you got questions for our panel of experts here.
I do. The first one is, how do we also begin to understand that our children are children, right? Like, and this comes back from, I hate to say it, but, slavery, and our kids see how we also treat other children and other people. And so when our kids come to us and they say, I'm not feeling well, I'm not, be strong, or this kid is bullying me. Oh, go beat him up, and if you don't beat him up, I'm going to beat you up, So we have to start understanding that our children are also human. I'm not trying to blame the victim, but there also are some things that we need to do as a people to help our children through this process. The other thing is that Dr. Menzies pointed out, especially like in places here in California where we don't have a lot of African American culturally congruent, counselors. How do we get other counselors to become culturally congruent and to look at our children as, to accept them as human, because they don't. That's part of the problem. That's a huge part of the problem. Our kids don't get the same passes that other children get. So how do we begin to address that? And like you said, they get this attention thinking, oh yeah, that other girl when she was bullied or whatever, and all the news media, it's all about attention and belonging. When are we going to start loving our children?
So, to be fair, we love our children. We love our children in the
Yes.
ways that we do. But you got to understand the context within which we have been living for so long has been a struggle to be accepted as human, right? It is like, ain't I a man, or I am a man? Walk around with signs like that, and Black women, being mistreated, during delivery, to where they run more risk of, either themselves or their baby dying. This is a systemic issue that we're talking about here. And anything, Mr. Neely Fuller Jr., one of my elders, I love the life. He talks about how, within the context of racism and white supremacy, everything that happens is a result of the existence of racism, white supremacy. And it's not a cop-out, taking the responsibility off of us to do what we can do, but it's just to give us that bigger framework within which to understand what it is that we're talking about here. And so when we're talking about, the service provider, how do we get more culturally competent service providers? So one of the things I did was literally step down off of the front lines of clinical work and began to train clinicians. I go into academia now. I'm training doctoral students. I'm helping people with their dissertation. I'm helping them as they're matriculating and taking these ethics courses. I'm showing them, the racist practice. I'm showing them, in Erickson's own words, when he talks about the N-word babies, instead of just his 8 stages. And so, we have to be able, and I'm doing this 30, 40, 50 students at a time. And so I said, it's better to just have one me on the front line. Let me get in the background and start to help to shape the minds of these future practitioners. And so, that's what the part that I can play. But, we're going to always be fighting this battle until we can somehow or another become a little more autonomous in how we address ourselves, how we identify ourselves, and how we live as ourselves.
Yeah, Sam Collins, I know, again, I'm throwing it to you. I know you got questions too.
Definitely. I really want us to take this whole idea of autonomy and culture to the next level. Given what has happened to us over the last few centuries, to what degree do we start entertaining the possibility of removing ourselves and shifting an entire paradigm all at once, so that our youth can enjoy life and can really, and so that we can all enjoy life on our own terms? What does that look like for us?
Yeah, not a small question at all, right? I think the biggest part of it is just validating our modes of healing, validating faith-based healing, validating going to the barbershop and talking to your barber, but just start looking into our own communities. I think so often we subscribe, and we talked about this in terms of just fixing the whole structure of therapy and getting more culturally competent therapists in there, which is obviously a big part of it. But I think an even bigger part of it is meeting the needs of our communities of color within our communities. And we are equipped to do so. It's just a matter of not invalidating those methods of healing that we have subscribed to for centuries as a community.
Yeah. And Dr. Sonny, let me ask you this. What actions do you take when you notice the signs in a loved one or a friend or someone? What actions should you take?
Yeah, I love the conversation. It's never just a one-sided thing, or more so in terms of problem solving. Like Sister Faye just mentioned, we have to look at the entire ecology. We have to go to various models. There's one model that I'm trained in, which is called MST, multi-systemic therapy, which looks at the child from the perspective of its community, of course, the immediate family, school, peer involvement, And of course, individually, what's going on with the child. So I think we have to connect with various institutions to best reach that child. But I think it first starts off with the home, and that means the parents. And that's whether it's being raised by grandparents or of course, the mother and father or uncles and aunties. It also means reaching children through sports, the arts. For a long time, I served as a juvenile probation officer. I worked in DJJ for quite some time. And the multi-systemic approach was one that, even tried to reach these kids to deter them from delinquent behaviors through various activities that we can engage and get them involved in. So it's the old adage, it's going to take a whole village. That's what I'm hinting at here. So it's bringing more persons in. Also, I think it's important to note the role of the church towards mental health, the role of the mosque towards mental health is real critical as well. Because I think at times the two are at odds, faith and science. And so a lot of times that can do person, not just children, but just anyone within our community, a disservice when we're not on the same page. So I think when there is that bridge, that's, when the gap is bridged between those two communities or those two institutions, we give persons a better chance at health.
Yeah. So we've established that this is real. We talk about stigma. We've established that it's real. So let me ask. But we talked about suicide, right? So is suicide classified as a mental illness?
Yeah. So you have various levels, as I mentioned earlier. You have suicide ideation. You have attempts. You have suicide attempts, and then you have a successful suicide. It sounds kind of crazy to say successful, but one that has been carried through and completed. And so oftentimes it is an indication of mental health issues, right? And so when a person seeks to terminate their life, it's often indicative of mental health issues. So it is a characteristic of one. A person who is actively attempting it or actively planning it, yes, that will be considered to be a mental health issue, right? It is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the 5th edition. So yes, in a nutshell, yes, it is indicative of mental health issues. It's kind of hard to say, is suicide a mental health issue? It's like it is a part of it, Yeah. And one thing I was thinking when a good brother, Dr. Etienne was saying, is that the whole systems approach, and when you look at the African-centered worldview, that's not a separate thing for us, and that's what I was talking about earlier, where we're functioning in the world to where it's optional to include the family system, right? When it's like from a certain worldview, it's impossible not to, right? Even if you only have the one person in front of you, I would have them do a projective measure, draw me a picture of your family, even if the child has been in foster care for 10 years. And that's, I would bring the family into the conversation that way through a drawing. Dr. McCray, Dr. Faye, she was earlier, you mentioned several times, sis, about talking in the beauty shop and the barber shops. We've got a phenomenal sister right there in the DC area, Dr. Afia and Billy Shaka, who has developed a culturally relevant, culturally competent, and culturally efficient model of dealing with mental health issues within the Black female population, and she calls it psychotherapy, and it's based in the whole approach to doing hair and how therapeutic that is. And so what she actually does is she trains and certifies even beauticians and as estheticians, I always mess that word up, to actually be a little more competent in what they're doing when they are providing those mental health services, so to speak. And so we have it, and it's steady growing. We have organizations and agencies that are doing these things. We just got to continue to push forward and make sure that at every chance we get, we are retooling ourselves and improving our ability to be effective with the people that we're working with.
And before we go back to the journalists again, but let me ask this question, because a lot of times we throw the words around like crazy or whatever. Can you speak to Dr. Sonny or Dr. Menzies, Faye? Can you speak to trigger words that we should avoid?
Yeah, you just said it. Crazy. Dr. McCray, Dr. Etienne, myself, it would be unethical for us to throw around words like crazy, and because we're the ones that's supposed to know better, right? And I think that's a part of the stigma, though, when people say, oh, he ain't right in the head. That's another way that we would say, in the old school vernacular. But yeah, we should definitely be be careful with those types of words, especially as practitioners and professionals. But I mean, in everyday conversation as well. I mean, anything that is slanderous or going against somebody's character, anything that's mean, slighting, disrespectful, or rude, just avoid all those things. We can't afford, we're good with joking on each other, playing the dozens and joning and all of that. But it's a time where some people are so sensitive that it could lead to a mass school shooting, if launched at the wrong person too consistent.
One of the things we like to do on this show is give people titles that they don't have. Dr. Chavis is famous for that. Faye is not a doctor. I know she appreciates, because she sounds like she's an expert, a doctor. Okay. He's an expert, but not a doctor. Go ahead, Faye.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's just so important to meet people where they are, though, because at Psych Central, we often find that a lot of gateways for people getting into our content is searching, am I crazy? Or they search language that could be otherwise stigmatizing. So we use that as an opportunity to educate people that no, you're not, you're using this language because you've been conditioned in this way, but here's the right vernacular and here's the right language to use. But thank you for the PhD.
Yeah, I was going to say that, like in the new Matrix film, there's the scene when the not the architect, but the analyst tells Neo, we don't use the word crazy in here. And it's the same thing, I think, in our field. But just by and large, we now spread that message to, we spread it to let others know that, no, it's words, what you'll typically hear within our close circles are things like, you all right, you good?
Yeah,
in so many ways, we're essentially getting at that point. How are you mentally? I've always thought, even when I was younger, like when we ask someone, how are you doing? We essentially are assessing for their mental wellness,
Right.
But how often there's not an answer to it. When in fact, it's a question that we're asking, how are you? Or even what's up?
Right.
So I think there are ways in which we can expand upon those terms that we normally use to really speak to checking in. How are you doing? What's really going on?
And really quickly, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Go ahead.
Okay, really quickly, when we look at some behaviors now, some behaviors are appropriate responses to what people are experiencing. And we might label it crazy, we might label it maladaptive, or even pathological, when in reality, it's an appropriate response to what it is that they're actually experiencing in life and what they're perceiving about reality. And unfortunately, we don't do enough, generally speaking, again, we don't do a good enough analysis of the society and the context within which we find people exhibiting mental illnesses to say, wait a minute, it might not be the person. It's actually the context. It's actually the environment. It's like you keep pulling three-eyed fish out of a lake. You can only blame the fish so long before you actually have to do a water testing and say, no, it's this water that's actually producing this. So it's not the people, it's the society, it's the context. It's the way that we are being manipulated subtly and sometimes very apparently, into behaving and presenting in certain ways. Like the young lady that recorded George Floyd being murdered, she had heart to stand there and do that and then to turn it in. And then all of the pressure that she received afterwards, if she became suicidal because of that trauma and because of the threats, both spoken and unspoken, if she became suicidal, to me, it would make sense. Was it the best approach, best response as spoken of earlier? No, but it would make sense that that's where she was headed with it.
Right.
Wow.
And Dr. Carter
Katrina?
called that race-based traumatic stress, right? At that point where she was actually going through that stress and trauma and recording, right? But
Yep.
I do want to go back to what James Wright said, about the counselors in schools. Have budgets? Do they have budgets for school counselors? Are they being cut? No, they do have budgets. The governors are giving these schools a lot of money right now, especially with the pandemic. But unfortunately, a lot of schools don't. Schools are now starting to address mental health. But before, they thought school counselors, were folks who were just, giving credits or making sure kids had enough credits to go to school. I believe one of our doctors can talk about the role of the school psychologist, right? That are also needed. So I think what we have to do as a community is hold them accountable, hold schools accountable, and have them hire more culturally congruent school counselors, school psychologists, and therapists for our students, because they are experiencing race-based traumatic stress and racial battle fatigue.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but in the school context, children are already labeled, a certain way. People already have certain expectations about how children are going to behave and act, especially, your public school in the inner city. Those children are already have, if you need 6 marks to make a diagnosis, they already got 5.5 of them, just in the teacher's mind sometimes, and the administration mind sometimes. I used to get kicked out of class on GP. They said, Jeff, get out. I said, for what? What do I do? Nothing. I just want to see how class goes without you today. That's a quote.
Wow.
And I wasn't a quote unquote bad kid. I was one that was very inquisitive, talkative, as y'all can tell, and the talkative part. But so when you have that situation, I literally had teachers bring kids to my office and say, hey, this kid got ADHD. We need to get him a diagnosis.
Yes.
And I'll be like, well, tell me what the criteria is, and I'll make sure I include that in the report. Well, I don't know. That's your job. Exactly. The kid is being written off before they even get a chance. And again, no evaluation on the teacher and how their class is set up. And if they're teaching to the children's learning styles, the teacher could be boring, and the kids get bored, they're going to act bored. But anyway, the school psychologist is there and supposed to be an advocate for the child. They're supposed to, my role is when I was an advocate for the children, I was also one that helped to identify if there were any needs that weren't being met. And then it was my job to make sure that those needs were being met. If child, we got to do everything that we're supposed to do first to make sure that the playing field is level for this child. And then also when the family come in, like we had an IE meeting or any meeting, a disciplinary meeting where parents were involved, I know I was supposed to stand with the school in a lot of situations, but I would stand neutral or with the parents because the school had enough arsenal. It was for the parent to have somebody that can help them to understand what's being stated here. Now, signing that really means this, that, and the third. The school like, yeah, sign it so we can get this child on some drugs. If you sign it, that means this, and this. So let's slow that down. You don't have to do it right now. That was more my role. And I think that we need more people that are willing and courageous enough to stand up and say, no, we're going to have a just hearing here. We're going to make sure that everything is okay. Everybody if anybody gets evaluated, everybody gets evaluated. Right. And we don't see that enough. I actually quit working as a school psychologist in Nashville because I said, I'm not going to be part of the system. I'm going to go in, I'm going to start training school psychologists to be better in these contexts, to stand up to y'all racist administrators.
And that's why we have a lot, and Stacey, I won't say anything else because I'm a journalist and an educator, but that's why we have a high percentage of our Black males and females who are in special education because they're suspended, expelled, and referred to special education on willful defiance, talking out, and we don't have enough doctors or school psychologists like Dr. Menzies who will stick up for our children and our families.
Yeah, and that's all a part of it, right, Katrina? The fact that we don't have enough doctors and specialists who look like us, that's a huge part of,
or even
of
teachers.
The problem. Or even teachers, exactly. Sam, I'm going to throw this one to you. This is Dr. Nicole McDaniel says, suppressing critical race theory is their way of not considering or acknowledging the environment's impact on our mental, physical, and financial health. I want your thoughts on that, Sam.
I'll take it a step further. If we are going to include education that's relevant to our young people, we got to move beyond 1619. Young Black people have to identify as Africans. They have to understand what was taken away from them, and they have to understand that they weren't slaves, that they were enslaved. In millennia before 1619, we were doctors, mathematicians, so forth and so on. And many of the first that we saw on American soil were a continuation of our African legacy. That's often the thing that hinders our young people. Once you start shaping young African children's worldview into making them think that they were born slaves, then you pretty much hinder their potential. And that's part of the reason why we see such an outburst in our schools, because young people, they want to see more than that. And speaking as a journalist who was also an educator, in the 22 months that I was in the public charter school system, I often deviated away from the curriculum to teach history that was more radical, in the sense that young people didn't see ancestors who were necessarily compliant with the system or pretty much accommodationist. They saw people who were more radical, in the sense that they went against the system. They went back to their African-centered ways. They looked more for self-determination and more things like that. And when young people start thinking in the realm of self-determination, they start taking more accountability for themselves. They start holding the system more accountable. And honestly, the system doesn't want young people who question everything. When young people question everything, they're too dangerous. And oftentimes that's where the labels come from. So if we are going to expand young people's worldview, let's not induce them with trauma porn. Let's add a bit of context. We were Africans, we still are Africans, and in doing so, we need to include the traditions. Where are the rites of passage programs? Where is the inclusion of the psycho, mental, and spiritual programs? When are we finally going to have a paradigm shift when all of that is included? That's what young people are looking for, even though they might not say it, they are saying it. And just to wrap it up, once again, we got to move beyond 1619. We just cannot be classified as slaves anymore, because we're not.
Well, let me bring this back a little bit, Sam. As always, we appreciate your commentary, always on point, for our experts. So, okay, I know someone down the road, down the street, a neighbor or a friend or a family member has got some mental health challenges, right? So what kind of conversation, what does that conversation, what should it look like between me and that person?
I'll start off. I think it all begins with empathy. That's number one. The ability to understand where the person's coming from. I mean, I get it all. I mean, I understand the specifics. So let's take something that I deal with a lot. The person who's the young man, often it's, right around the 18, 19, who's starting to exhibit what we call initial psychotic break. It's seeing the signs. Something's going on with this young man. And then it's getting more people involved within the immediate family, or even sometimes it is the school that becomes the first responders to this young person. It's then having the person evaluated. Sometimes that happens with a Baker Act or a person being placed in a psychiatric hospital. But then it leads to consideration of, do we consider medication? Do we just do psychotherapy with the person? Or do we try alternative approaches? Because it's not always therapy. Yes, I'm a psychotherapist, but I don't think it's always therapy. I think it's the combination, as I mentioned earlier, of various sources that can help a person. Let's take the young child who does want to hurt him or herself. Let's have a sit down with that person. Now, the question becomes, who's that person that's going to have that sit down? One of the great things that I love about what I'm hearing today is the African-centered approach, because I don't think that are some of the models that have been used to help our children really fit them. And that's why sometimes some young people don't even want to be a part of it. They don't want no parts of therapy. CBT, of course, is considered, the standard, evidence-based approach to take. I particularly like the existential approach. Our kids think. Our kids have questions about the meaning of life. You can hear it in their music. I often love to reference hip hop lyrics. And one of the more telling hip hop classic albums was really that of looking at one's self-worth, or Ready to Die. The whole album is Biggie looking at his life. Let's not even talk about Tupac. We already know what he was, what his central message was. But then even recently with the artist that was that we lost, I think in 2018, XXXTentacion, who utilized his platform to talk about what he was going through internally. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think hip hop therapy is very, very important. Speaking the kids' language, entering their world, utilizing the medium or the platform that they connect with, and starting that conversation with them. Now that's younger persons, but how about that stay-home mom who is struggling with anxiety, has lost a sense of self? She may not readily want to just, go to therapy. So then that's why I say it's not just therapy. It's also, is it going to be that cousin? Is it going to be that aunt who just has enough tools to just have conversations with that person and hopefully get them maybe to a pastor, or maybe it is to a woman's group. That's not necessarily the traditional one-to-one individual counseling. So I love the work you're doing, Dr. Menzies, just as far as you're taking it a step beyond. You're trying to help correct the problem from an institutional level that then leads to how we're going to get more practitioners and teachers and so forth who are in these roles, who can now inform and equip the persons that I guess we're hoping to rely on to begin to have these type of conversations with persons. It always is a conversation, whether it's talk therapy or whether it's a sermon or whether it's a sit down with a PCP. It's a conversation that happens, but it's being equipped, number one, with empathy. That usually, because there's an old saying, no one cares about what you know. They want to know that you care. If we can just start with that perspective, I think we could start to help persons, at least get them the help they need.
And if I
So
could jump
go
in,
ahead, Faye. Go ahead, Faye.
yeah, there's a number of organizations doing some great work. That Dark Beauty Healing offers free therapy to women of color. You have Beam, that's a community organization that's also meeting the needs of people in their communities. You know, we talked a lot about community care, which is very important. I was a disability attorney for almost 10 years. You know, a lot of times getting Western help is a gateway to being able to get the money to take the time off. Mental health care is health. You know, and oftentimes it is debilitating. It can get in the way of your ability to work. So it's important to sometimes to seek those evaluations and get those diagnoses from trusted organizations so that you can get the care that you need to heal. So I just wanted to add that very important part.
And Dr. Menzies, there are more than 230 African-American owned newspapers and media companies within the National Newspaper Publishers Association as the Black Press of America. What can we do, Dr. Menzies, to help this situation, to put a dent in those troubling stats that we continue to see?
Wow, great question. And you're right. A very, very powerful organization this NNPA is. I would say, you know, if somehow, and if I could wave a magic wand, and I would make it so that each one of the 230 newspapers that you just spoke of would dedicate a certain amount of space to self-care and mental health related issues. And it would just be something that would just show up in each and every one of the newspapers each and every time it's printed. There would be a dedication and a devotion to destigmatizing. And it would done in plain language, done in a very empathetic way of doing it, very humane, and very informative at the same time, you know, because there are ways, you know, the power of the press, you know, you can move crowds. You can move crowds to joy. You can move crowds to riots. And so, you know, you can also move crowds to be more self-caring, you know, self-loving and compassionate towards themselves and each other, and also encouraging people to get out there. And, you know, it's okay to not be okay, you know, and these are the ways that you can help yourself to become okay when you're not. I think that's what, if I could wave a magic wand, each one of those newspapers would have a column devoted to mental health, wellness, self-care.
That sounds excellent to me as well. Dr. Menzies, it's such an important topic. I'm going to let our journalists back in to give some closing thoughts on this. Let's start with Katrina. Katrina, your closing thoughts on this and any questions you might have. Katrina?
I'm muted.
We can't hear you.
This was an excellent panel. And I do want to say, too, that in addition to the NNPA giving, you know, our news media outlets giving coverage, we also need to start funding our projects, right? We have a great model called the Iminyata Village Project, Iminyata program in Seaside, California, and it deals with mental health, after school, counseling. They have an equine therapy program, and it's all African centered, and they give resources for our students and our families. We need more programs like that, but oftentimes our programs don't sustain themselves due to funding. So we have to start funding our programs too. We know what to do. We just need to continue it with resources and supporting ourselves.
Absolutely. Sam Collins?
All I can say is, well, first of all, many thanks once again for the opportunity. This was really a great dialogue, a great reasoning. I'm going to say let's be on the lookout for students continuing to protest and showing us exactly what it is that they want. Right now, they are responding to the chaos that we continue to sweep under the rug. We continue to act as though it's business as usual, and the young people are showing us differently. So they are pushing the dial forward, and until we start changing things, it's going to keep continuing to be chaos on their end.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Sonny?
No, I'm just grateful for being on the panel. Thank you for having me. Mental health stigma is real, and the mental help is also real. We're here. We're in every state. I travel the country, and I get a chance to interact with, so many great folks that are doing the work. I remember back when I was in seminary, one of my professors grabbed me and he said, "Sonny, you sure you want to go into theology? You sure you want to go behind the pulpit?" And I was like, and he told me, "You belong in the front lines, dude, and the front lines." And that's when I I'm a seminary dropout. Seminary dropout. I decided I belong in the front lines, and it's just great to see fellow colleagues, that are doing the work. We're not all therapists, but we're all healers in our own way, and we utilize our voice as a vehicle to help move and push the culture, and more importantly, to save our children. As the great Marvin Gaye said, a world that's ready to die, who's willing to try? And we're the ones that are willing to try to save that generation.
We got somebody who quoted Biggie and now Marvin Gaye in the same show. Man, this has been an awesome show this morning, just with that alone. Faye McCray, I know Healthline Media is doing a lot. I want you to give us your closing thoughts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's all we do on Psych Central. We talk about these issues. We talk about mental health. As the leader of the brand, it is really important to me that we move with an eye of health equity and cultural competence. We just published a great piece on code switching and how that impacts our mental health, and how not being able to show up authentically in the workplace can impact how you're struggling in life. So we have so many resources available for people of color, and we'll continue to put those out there and have these conversations.
Yeah, and Dr. Menzies, as you give your closing thoughts, could you also provide perhaps a hotline number or some sort of resource that people can reach out to who might be experiencing a crisis?
Okay. I had somebody had the Google hotline number for me real quick. I don't keep that one stored. I do have resources I could recommend though, but again, thank you all. I really appreciate the invitation to participate. With my esteemed colleagues here, the honorary Dr. McCray, good brother Dr. Sonny. I want to say, brother, I actually was going to divinity school and decided to go for psychology instead. So I didn't even get inside the gates. I said, I'm gonna go this way instead. But then I later learned that psychology is literally the word, it's the study of the soul. And that's so the work that we're doing, the Western model again tells us that we're dealing with the brain and the behaviors, brains and cognition and behavior of people, when in reality we're dealing with the soul of people, again, according to the original word and our own ancestral worldview. And so we're still doing that spiritual work, that psycho-spiritual work, but we're doing it in the context of psychology. But I just want to say, special shout outs and prayers going to Regina King and her family, and any and everybody else who has lost someone to suicide, and because they don't have the celebrity, we don't know about it. People are suffering every day. People are losing loved ones every day. People are going to lose some today. And, stress and suicide are like silent killers. You rarely see them coming. And so, for those who might have survivor's remorse or survivor's guilt, when a loved one transitions, it may have been nothing that you could have done about that. So just be okay with accepting that part. And just understanding that, we got to just keep pushing and keep living and trying to do better every chance that we get. Because unfortunately, none of us could understand the owner's manual that each of the children come with, because we do come with them. We haven't been taught to read them. We haven't been taught to apply them. And so we're still working on this thing. And so, prayers out to everybody who's suffering right now. Anybody who's suffering mental illness, people who are suffering with loss. If there is a brighter day coming, and just keep doing better. Just keep doing better in life.
Yeah, and it is truly, truly helpful to talk about it. And for those who are experiencing the crisis, there is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255. That's 800-273-8255. And a great resource in the Washington, D.C. area is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. Reach out to them as well. We thank you so much for joining us this morning on this very, very special discussion that we had. It's a discussion that needs to continue. And certainly we need to do all we can in the Black community to erase any stigma that's left surrounding mental illness. We thank you, and we will see you tomorrow.